Hello, and welcome once again to Your Faith Question. Your Faith Questions is a segment where we get to discuss some of those difficult faith questions that you may be having. We thank all of you that have journeyed with us thus far, and we just thank God for the privilege of recording 13 episodes. And we welcome you to continue sending whatever questions that you may have to media@nairobibaptist.co.ke. As we promised last episode, we will actually be having a live session after next episode. And so we look forward to that. Please gear up for that. Tell your friends. We will have it at a time that is convenient so that you'll be at the comfort of your home so that you will join us. And today I am joined again by our senior pastor, Reverend Calisto Odede.
Thank you
Welcome,
very much.
sir. But also I am joined by our lead pastor in Westlands, Reverend Erastus Weru. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
It is a joy to have you gentlemen with me, and we just want to talk about a subject that perhaps you have interacted with, but there is a resurgence that is happening, and perhaps people have asked you several questions regarding your faith, especially you who is an African. Yes, today we are talking about African Christianity. So let's just delve in at this moment. Sirs, and sir, I don't think it's even an African title. But permit me to use it. There's a statement, a popular statement that is made that Christianity is a white man's religion. Maybe we can start with Reverend Weru. Do you care to comment on that particular statement?
Well, I do think that Christianity really is not a white man's religion.
Yeah.
First and foremost, from church history angle, Christianity reached Africa long before it ever reached Europe.
Europe, yeah.
We had the first church fathers, theologians from Africa, people like Origen. For about 600 years, Christianity was in Africa and not in Europe.
Yeah.
So if you look at it from that angle, Christianity is not a white man's religion.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, it's also not a white man's religion because the origin of Christianity, again, is not Europe. Europe was evangelized just the way Africa has been evangelized.
Yeah.
The origin of Christianity is Asia, is Middle East, as we all know, and not in Europe.
Okay. Senior Pastor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Pastor Mokaya. I think this is quite an important subject in view of the fact that as Africans, we sometimes struggle with our identity.
Yeah.
Am I African first and then a Christian? Am I a Christian and then an African? And when we have, especially those who attempt to dismiss Christianity on the ground that it is not an African religion, on the ground that it actually originated from elsewhere. It's a white man's religion.
Yeah.
And those who usually would say so have in the background or in their mind the thought that the white man, meaning the Europeans, used Christianity in order to subjugate Africans. And I think so it is important for us to look at who makes that statement.
Yeah.
Because it's not coming out of a vacuum. And we have two seasons, if I would pick up Kenya, in which that statement has been made. The first time it was made was at the very beginning when the missionaries started coming and churches were being established in Kenya, the early 1927, 1930s there, here in Kenya. And it came out because the missionaries then came into Africa, and the way they conducted themselves, one would say sometimes they may have, one would say, castrated our cultures, because they went to an extreme where some things they dismissed for you to become a Christian,
Yeah.
you are to be like one of them.
Yeah.
And so we had a team, a group of African churches that began coming up, and they said, wait a little bit, we want Christianity, but we don't want to practice it the way these people are telling us. And that was the birth of the African independent churches or indigenous churches. As a result of that, a number of those churches came up. I may not mention them, but a number of those churches came up during that time. Now, some of the people who were key then tended to reject the version of the Christianity that the missionaries were giving, in view of a desire to have a kind of an independence, both cultural independence, but also those were also the beginning of the political movements in the country here.
Yeah.
We were beginning to have people like Hari Thuku and freedom of thinking. And so people who began associating Christianity with colonialism, commerce and civilization, tended to see Christianity as a white man's religion, so they rejected them. The second move actually came in the early 70s, especially again here in Kenya, but that particular move was more of the elites, people who have gone to universities, professors, and the very highly educated. It was the time people were dropping their so-called Christian names, and they were basically being called by their African names only. At that particular time, many of them some were leaning towards Marxist ideas, ideology, some were leaning towards liberation theology, and they felt the African needed to become independent of any Western attachment. And as a result of that, Christianity was also associated with Western leaning. So it was also thrown out of the window, saying Christianity is actually a Western, white man's religion. So those are the contexts. And in view of this, I think they may have had a point, especially when some of the missionaries went to the extreme in rejecting everything that was African. But I do not think we can outrightly say that Christianity is an African religion. That statement is a white man's religion. I think that statement is an extreme statement.
All right. That said then, because the title of this particular episode is African Christianity, that said then, is there anything like African Christianity? And if there is, which one precedes the other? Are you African first and then a Christian, or are you a Christian first and then an African?
I do think that I would agree that there is something we would call African Christianity. As we have already said, Christianity was in Africa first and foremost, long before it reached the Europeans. But the phase we are in Christianity in Africa, it is true that we were evangelized for the last about 200 years by the Europeans. And when they came, they evangelized us, and as the senior pastor has already insinuated, there's a way in which they tried to almost reject everything African. And that did not help much in as far as some African tradition practices are concerned, especially practices that have to do with rites of passage, the birth of children, naming of children, initiation, weddings and marriages, and finally death and burial. I think when it comes to those rites of passage, you see a lot of African traditional religion raising its head, almost regardless of the community, African community, that you have in mind. And so in most of those incidences, you'll find that there is what is acknowledged as Christian, but also there's a lot of allegiance to the traditional aspects around that rite of passage. Even like when you talk about weddings, we agree we have the white wedding in the church, but we also agree we have the traditional wedding, which is equally important. And almost every couple who comes to get married in the church will have first and foremost fulfilled the requirement at a traditional at a traditional level. And this is something that's
Yeah.
acknowledged
Yeah.
and accepted in some communities in this country. When it comes to burying their dead, the church will finish her part, and the pastor will actually even leave the homestead, and the community will be left fulfilling other traditional rites. And I do think that there's a blood of Christianity that you do not find elsewhere, apart from maybe in Africa. Yeah. So I would agree that there is a blood of Christianity which we can call African Christianity.
And what then I'm wondering is, are we calling it African Christianity because of how they are expressing their Christianness, if that is even a word? Or why would we call it African Christianity? Is it because Christianity is expressed within the eyes of the cultural practices?
I think the question here is a question of identity. Do I identify myself as a Christian? And if I identify myself as a Christian, how do I practice my Christianity in such a way that I am still an African without not necessarily losing, if I may say so, my Africanness? And because of the question of identity, some people tend to go around a spectrum, and in that spectrum there are some things that they consider this is African, and not just the skin pigment. It's our way of life, our style of doing things. For example, African Christianity, Christianity in Africa, let me use that phrase, Christianity in Africa need not necessarily be the same as Christianity in Europe, because there are things we do differently. The way we sing in an African context, music and movement is very, very synonymous. So that when an African sings, they make some movements more often than not. So if I'm practicing my Christianity where I'm very rigid, the question of I have borrowed too much of the European Christianity rather than the African Christianity. The whole question of openness to the supernatural, which in the Western culture is becoming less and less, but the fact that I believe in the spirit world and I believe there are things like demons as an African, that actually makes me very close to the biblical context, where actually we see Jesus also believed in the spirit world. And so when we hear now of Christianity declining in the West and Christianity thriving in Africa, one of the reasons I think so, why that is so is because the African Christian practice their Christianity in a manner that is very close to their culture. And as they do that, there are some things within that actually helps Christianity to move. When we think of the sacrificial system, and a missionary would come and say, Christ is the sacrifice that was paid for my sins. In our African culture, I don't struggle with that, because already within our context, we had traditionally sacrificial systems. So this becomes a stepping stone for me to believe more in the gospel. Yes, there should be something like African Christianity, and there should be a very clear identity of that, but not in the way in which he said it. I think the way he said it is very good, because it's bringing about the elements that leads to the negative aspects of that. And there are many times we practice it, and we only, I would call that dual allegiance. We have a kind of dual allegiance. We have this allegiance to the purity of the gospel, walking with the word, and then when the issues come, the initiations, the cultural issues, or when even I have questions, metaphysical questions that cannot be answered in any other way, I dive down, become subterranean, I dive down and go back into my African context and begin to look for certain answers that do not actually contradict the word of God. So I think we need to view it that way, that there is an essence in which the way I practice my Christianity should not necessarily be superimposed in the way someone would practice their Christianity in New York or in London. But it should be some authentic African way in which I practice my Christianity. But at the same time, being aware that I do not go to the extent where I have dual allegiance in my faith.
You've talked about we should practice our Christianity in a manner that doesn't seem as though it's been superimposed by a different culture. And as Reverend Weru was speaking, one of those things he mentioned is how in weddings, for example, you will do the cultural wedding, and then I like your choice of words, and then you will do the white wedding in church. And here begs the question, the whole idea of calling it a church wedding, where did that come from? Is it really a church wedding, or is it actually a white cultural wedding?
Wow.
Well, I do think that when it comes to some of these practices, our brothers and sisters, the missionaries, they did the best they could do at the time at which they came to Africa, primarily because our practices, our traditional practices as Africans were also very closely tied to the worship. So whether you're talking of the traditional wedding, there's a very thin line between the actual traditional wedding and the way communities worship. And even when it comes to the burial, everything in Africa is almost religion. As someone said, Africans are notoriously religious. And I do think that these are some of the things that made the missionaries to do away with everything that was African tradition. They didn't try or even attempt to redeem some of the practices that the Africans were practicing. And in so doing, we have something like the way we do our weddings in this country, which is the same in a number of African countries, where we do 3 weddings. The civil wedding, where we issue the certificate. There's the traditional wedding, where we go and fulfill what our parents are telling us. And I think majority of Africans will do that. And then there's the church wedding, which sometimes we call the white wedding. Although actually in the church wedding, our major interest are the vows, that commitment of a couple between themselves in the presence of witnesses, in the midst of the church and a crowd of witnesses, committing themselves before God to live with one another, at all times, regardless of what is going on. So I do think that inability of the missionaries to reconcile the African wedding and the Christian wedding made them to cut links completely. But I do think that, and I don't know what the senior pastor would say on this, I do think that there's a way in which the institution would have been perhaps redeemed so that we are not having to do three weddings. We see how we can redeem that institution such that we only do one wedding. Yes. Yes. I don't know what you'd add.
No, I think he has said that very well. And the context is that sometimes we go through with young people who intend to get married, and you really feel for them because they actually do three weddings. And those who came out of the missionary movement and what the churches have adopted is that the government has a requirement, you must do the civil aspect so that you get the certificate. And then the churches have a requirement that you must do the church vows for your wedding to be acceptable in the eyes of the church. And then the parents have, you must do something cultural in our context. So in a sense, they appear to be 3. Now, the ones of the parents, although of significance, now the government is beginning to recognize traditional marriage, and more recently we have seen some celebrity Kenyan politicians getting married in the traditional way, which I think maybe they may have accepted also from some of the community. But I think for the Christian, the important element is that the reason why the missionaries may have rejected this is there were some practices within that African marriage that they saw as invoking the spirit world or appeasing the spirit world or offering sacrifices to the spirit world.
Yeah.
Now, if those other elements are removed and we are just remaining with the good relationships, then, as he says, there's no reason why the churches should not recognize and a pastor comes to that function and takes people through that moment, and you just have one wedding instead of 3 weddings, provided you're not going the other side where you begin to appease the other side.
And I think the thought that is coming to my mind, even as both of you are speaking, I'm wondering, both of you are fathers and both of you are pastors. Why don't you just, and you are Africans, why don't you just marry the 3 and, you know? But anyway.
I have been to an African country where the church is not allowed to issue the marriage certificate by the government. So a couple will do the traditional wedding in their homes, then go to the government officer, they do the civil wedding, then they come to church. You know, at least in Kenya, the civil part and the church part,
is
if you are
combined.
Christian and you want to come to church, we are authorized by the government to give you a certificate.
Wow, complicated things. But Paul speaks in Acts chapter 17, verse 26. And this is what Paul says. Acts 17:26. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And the question that I wonder, just from what Paul is speaking to these philosophers, is what is the relationship between culture and Christianity? Because what by and large Paul is speaking about here has to do with culture, because when people live within particular places and in an appointed time, then there are cultural values and practices that come about. So what is the relationship between Christianity and culture?
Someone has defined kasha as deviation from divine. So you are being kasharal when you have deviated from that which is divine. Because elsewhere in the first chapter of Romans, Paul tells us that what needs to be known about God can actually be perceived just looking at the creation. And so long as you have deviated from the divine, then you become kasharal. And when you go to a kasha that is not evangelized, that has not received the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, you will always be confronted by some certain kasharal aspects that are in agreement with the Bible, that are neutral, and others which are outrightly opposed or contrary to the scriptures. And so when, for example, you come to Africa, almost any African community you get into, the issue of hospitality is very well practiced and accepted. And it is so well articulated in the scriptures. So that's an aspect of an African culture, for example, which doesn't need to be redeemed. It just needs to be anchored on some scriptural references. There are some other aspects you will find that are neutral. They are neither here nor there. You know, the shirt you are wearing today and the shirt I'm wearing today, you are no better if you don't wear that one, if you wear what I'm wearing, or I'm no less if I wear what you are wearing. So that's a neutral cultural expression. But also there are some other cultural expressions that are quite anti-scripture, that have to do with morals. There are some cultural practices that encourage sexual immorality, that encourage greed, corruption, and all that. And I do think that in whichever culture you get into, you will always be confronted by those three. So there's a way in which kasha will partner or becomes a partner of the gospel in as far as it has not deviated from the divine.
Yeah.
While at the same time, there are some aspects that become now anti the scripture, and that is where man has deviated from that which is divine.
Yeah.
That's how I would look at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say that this is one of the debates that has gone on, especially among African African cultural scholars, where you have categories of some of the scholars saying there is a wall between Christianity and
Culture.
tradition, culture. And that wall is such that if you try to bring them together, you end up with a mixture of religion, what they're calling syncretism. So scholars like Biancato would actually say, no, no, no. And a lot of Christianity practice, especially from the East African revival, took that position. And it was a very hard position where they disassociated completely, tried to disassociate completely from the African culture. Then you have some scholars that says, no, actually there is a bridge in between, and things flow over the bridge.
Yeah.
So people like Bediako Kwame from Ghana would tend to be in that category where there is a bridge, and the bridge is a flow that people can, things can pass over from one side to the other. I tend to take the position of a stepping stone, like crossing a river. There are some things that from the culture you can actually use them as stepping stones in order to enhance Christianity. And I've mentioned, for example, the belief in the supernatural, which is within the African culture. And if you use that right, it actually can help to make Christianity grow. And Pastor Weru has mentioned hospitality and some of those things. I put them in three categories like Pastor Weru, but I use the phrase, the 3 R's of culture and how we relate to them. In every culture, there are things that are good. And the things that are good, we need to retain them. We don't throw them out of the window. There are things that are neutral, and the things that are neutral, they can be used both for evil and also for good. We need actually to redeem them. And things like drums, for example, we use the drums in worshiping God in a church, but the drums are also used to invoke evil spirits by in a traditional setting. So that's a neutral thing that can be used in either way. But then there are others also that are evil, and the evil ones we reject. So retain, redeem, reject, depending on where they are at. And in that way, Christianity can still be able to use the good aspects of culture in order to push forward. So they are partners, as one think of it in that way.
Okay.
In fact, there are scholars who believe that until we are able to merge the gospel and the African kasha, the African Christianity will remain, as it has been described by others, a mile wide and an inch deep, until the day or the generation that will be able to merge the two and redeem as much of this kasha as possible, so that the call to Christianity is not a call for to depart from what has been passed on from generation to generation.
Okay. And the question that I have, because we've talked quite a bit about culture, is there anything like a Christian culture? Because when the people, for example, that use the analogy of a wall, the Bible doesn't tell us how to dress. The Bible doesn't tell us what foods to eat. The Bible doesn't tell us at what age I should get married. A lot of those things, I believe, are informed by culture. So what I wonder then is there anything like the Christian culture?
Christianity originated from Palestine, the Middle East, and it came into the Middle East in a cultural context. and the culture that it acquired was the Middle Eastern culture. Someone has written a book, Jesus with the Middle Eastern eyes. And so there are practices within the Christian context that at the early church, they were purely cultural practices. And one reading the Bible would see those. Now, when Christianity moves into an area, oftentimes it is not a potted plant.
Yeah.
A potted plant, you take it with its soil, and all you have to do is keep watering it, but it stays in its soil.
Yeah.
And the soil is the cultural element. It is actually a seedling, and the seedling is taken and transplanted into a new soil and is supposed to grow in that new soil. So the gospel is a seedling that comes into a cultural context and is supposed to grow in that soil.
Yeah.
That's why a famous Asian author has written, give the Indian water in an Indian calabash. If I would say so, give the African water, Christianity in an African calabash.
Yeah.
And when you do that, the identity with Christianity is much, much greater than when you actually draw a wall.
Yeah.
So yes, those who bring about the issue of a wall have fears, and the fears they have is a fear of mixing the negative elements in culture with Christianity.
Yeah.
But those fears actually weighed against teaching people how to live their Christian life within the culture would actually be overweighed, because helping people to live the Christian life in their culture will make Christianity thrive and grow much more than if you isolate them and remove them out of their cultures.
Okay, okay. So this is the question. This will be our concluding question. Paul talks to the Galatians, for example. They have received Christ through the preaching of Paul. But some Jews have come, and they not only want these Galatians to be believers, but also they want them to carry out a certain Jewish practice, circumcision in this instance, and tell them you are not Christian enough if you are not circumcised. And Paul is furious with them. In fact, in chapter 3 of Galatians, he calls them, you foolish Galatians, says, if you do this, you're actually putting aside the grace of God. So what I wonder, when we take certain cultural aspects that are European and not necessarily biblical, and they form sort of the whole of our Christianity, might we be falling in the same danger as the Galatians?
You know, I like the illustration Pastor Calisto has used of a potted plant and a seedling.
Yeah.
And it is unfortunate that most of the times, as the gospel moves from one community to another, it carries with it some cultural practices, you know, because it's not moving in a vacuum.
Yeah.
You know, so when Nairobians, for example, let's not even talk about the Europeans. When Nairobians take the gospel to the coastal region, we carry with us some cultural practices that we practice here in Nairobi. Like punctuality is very important in Nairobi. It may not be important in some cultural in some communities outside of Nairobi that may value just community time and the like. And I do think that one of the tasks of a true missionary is to do a peeling of the gospel, of the clutter that's around the gospel, so that what we are transplanting, as we have said, from Nairobi to Nyeri, from Nairobi to Kisii, or from Europe to Nairobi, is not the gospel that has the covering of the cultural practices of the community that is transplanting the gospel from that community to the next community. Because even just going back to your other question on is there something like a Christian kasha? When you look at the book of Galatians and other books written by Paul and even the other apostles, I would think what you see as a Christian kasha really is the character, is the Christian character. It is not the covering, it's not the clothing, it's not the eating, what you eat, it is not the language you use, it has nothing to do with those. It is actually the Christian character.
Yeah.
It's about joy.
Yeah.
It's about faith.
Yeah.
It's about hospitality, as we have talked about it. It's about being good. It's
Yeah.
about serving people.
Yeah.
That is what I would call the Christian kasha.
Yeah.
The rest is a covering of the gospel, which sometimes we seem to give more emphasis.
Yeah.
You know, and I would say that even the way we received the gospel from the West, it did have some covering,
Yeah.
You know, which we are still struggling to
And which we are giving more
to shed
emphasis.
off,
Yeah.
and which we keep giving a lot of emphasis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say Christianity itself is supracultural. It fits and enters into each culture, regardless of whatever culture it is. It goes on into each culture.
Yeah.
But the way we practice it is contextual. And by contextual, I simply mean we need to bring it in a way that people do not reject the message. And they're not rejecting the message because the message is bad, but they're rejecting the message because of the package we have used to take the message.
Yeah.
And so as Christians, we have to do critical contextualization by analyzing the gospel. What is the package in this? What is the core in this?
Yeah.
And incidentally, when Kenyans go to Nigeria to plant a Kenyan church in Nigeria, oftentimes it has a lot of elements that are Kenyan. And so you find people in Nigeria who are behaving like Kenyans because the Kenyans have taken a church there. When Nigerians bring a church to Kenya, oftentimes you'll find it has a lot of elements of Nigerian in it. So Kenyans who are behaving like Nigerians because of some of the packages. Now, that's what we would mean by critically contextualizing it, thinking through what is this which is the gospel, what is this which is basically the context in which the gospel has come from, and be able to dismiss that context and remain with the core, which is the gospel for us.
Wonderful. Finally, your last words to our viewers, and then Reverend Weru, and we will bring it to a close.
I think this is a very, very important element because we are beginning to see a resurgence of people going back to their African tradition. And perhaps there is something within Christianity that we have practiced that is actually making them go back. And it is time for us to begin asking questions of are we helping people to identify with Christianity, or are we making them feel like Christianity is actually foreign to them, that they are going back into some of the African traditions.
All right, thank you. Reverend Weru.
I think for me, what I would say as a closing remark is to remind our viewers that Christianity has its roots in Africa. Jesus came to Africa as a baby. The church in Egypt, the Coptic church, long before the church went to Europe, the whole of North Africa was Christian long before the gospel traveled to Europe. So there's nothing true about the Christianity being a white man's religion. This is ours. This is our faith, and we should practice it without without that mentality that it was brought to us by the Europeans. You know, nothing is further from the truth than that, because we practiced Christianity long before the Europeans practiced Christianity. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you who is watching us. Thank you for joining us. This actually has been part 1 of this particular episode on African Christianity. I invite you to send whatever questions you may have on this subject especially, and whatever other subject you may have, so that we may tackle them when we do the next episode. Again, the place to send that is media@nairobibaptist.co.ke, or even at the comment section. Feel free to just write your question there. We will pick it up and we will address it, God allowing. So thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to joining again together with you in the next episode. Until then, the Lord bless you.